This is Rising Phoenix Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Rhodes. This podcast is for men struggling with an unwanted divorce. I interview experts on divorce, mental health, and I provide insights gained from my own divorce journey. You are not alone. Join me. Joining me today is Dr. Hoy. Dr. Hoy, let's just jump right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Luzia Hoy, and I am currently an assistant professor for interdisciplinary social sciences at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And I've basically been doing research about feelings of loneliness for about 9 years. I did my PhD at the University of Groningen, also in the Netherlands, about loneliness in different cultures. And I did study psychology originally.
Wow. Okay. So, is it fair to say you're an expert on loneliness?
I think it's always difficult to say that about yourself. But
Sure.
let's say if people want to have book chapters about loneliness in different cultures, then usually by now I'm being approached. Or also sometimes about loneliness in space. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I've covered this topic many times because I think, I don't think I know. I deal with loneliness, of course, as a divorced
Mm.
man who's still single, and so do many divorced men and many people. So, but what I like to do on the podcast is typically I start by defining things. So I'm going to ask you to define loneliness. What is it? How do you define it?
Yeah. So loneliness is a feeling. That's, I think, the most important thing to say because loneliness is very often mixed up with being alone in the way that media report about it. So very often people say that people who have, or like in the media, it's said that people who have few social relationships or who spend a lot of time alone are lonely people. But loneliness itself, at least the way we treat it in psychology, is really this feeling of disconnection. And it can take very different shapes. And that's very important. It's not something that feels the same for each individual. Sometimes it is defined as a feeling of isolation. But to be honest, most of the time when I talk to people, they define it as I don't feel understood. I feel separate from others. I don't feel supported enough by others. I feel like I am, in a way, separated by something like a glass wall from others. So even though there are others around, I just feel very lonely. I feel like I don't belong. So basically, it's very many different experiences or feelings of our relationships not being able to provide us with something that we would like them to. So that is like the very general definition of loneliness, just because it can feel very differently for different people. And maybe because I said social isolation, being alone is different from feeling lonely. Of course, if you are alone a lot or if you have few relationships, those are risk factors for feeling lonelier. But many people who feel lonely are not socially isolated or do often also not spend so much time alone.
Wow, that is fascinating. Okay, wow, there's a lot here. Okay. So in terms of, this is kind of your specialty. This next question I'm going to ask, but it's sort of, I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball in there, just in terms of is the experience of loneliness different across cultures? Because I think that's kind of what you look at. But also, I'm curious if you have any data or have come to any conclusions about the differences in genders. Like, is there a difference between how men and women experience loneliness?
So to start with the cultural aspects, there are different ways in which loneliness can be different across different cultures. So I think you asked mainly about what it means. So if it means different things across different cultures, but then there are also other aspects such as how often does it occur? So how lonely do people feel across different cultures? Do they feel lonely for the same reasons? Are certain risk factors the same across cultures? So if we start with the meaning part, there is actually not so much research about it. So that's why we did a study where we talked to people between the age of 25 and 45 in Austria, Israel, Bulgaria, Egypt, and I'm trying to think, oh, in India. So there we talked to different people about what they mean when they say themselves, I feel lonely. And there we saw again that the ways that people describe loneliness are very diverse. But let's say the range of different definitions were quite similar across cultures. So it seemed that people do mean quite something similar in at least these different cultures. Of course, it's difficult to say something about other cultures that we didn't examine, but these cultures are very different in the way that people live together with each other, how much time they spend alone. And still, when we asked them about their experiences of loneliness, A, they usually knew what we meant. B, most people had had experiences of loneliness throughout their lives. And C, like the definitions were quite comparable.
Hmm.
Um, that is something different, of course, than how often does loneliness occur in these different cultures. And there seem to be some differences. It's a bit difficult, really, to compare because people tend to report loneliness perhaps in different ways. Often we have these kind of different ways of reporting that come along with how we also speak, how much we express our emotions, how much we also admit to have certain emotions. And then usually people would expect that people feel lonelier in cultures where people spend more time alone, live alone more, perhaps also where divorce rates are higher. So this is usually what people would expect. But then the numbers actually suggest something different. So the findings are quite mixed. Most studies that were done in different European countries, which also vary in the extent to which people live with family versus alone. So here, usually people in the more collectivistic cultures, the more family-oriented cultures, they usually reported higher loneliness than in the countries where people, like when more people live alone and spend more time alone. But we can talk about that maybe later as well. It's quite unintuitive to most people because most people would expect people to feel less lonely in more communal, more family-oriented cultures. But I can also, if that's of interest, explain
Yeah.
why that might be
Yeah. Definitely.
later. Yeah. Or should I talk about that now, or should I go to
Um,
the
well,
aspect first?
I'm curious about if you've noticed anything gender wise. Like, is there anything in the studies in the just because this podcast is technically for men, although I know I have female listeners, I'm just curious if there is how it's experienced, if it's experienced differently, or if you've seen one more than the other in terms of self-reported or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Is there any sort of data that pops out in gender differences?
So what I like, I haven't done research about this myself, but I know it from my colleague Marlies Maas, who I also share an office with. She has done a meta-analysis, so a summary of different
Yeah.
empirical studies about gender differences in loneliness, and they find that usually, on average, there do not really seem to be clear gender differences in how often people report loneliness.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. So it doesn't really seem that there are clear differences. I do think, though, that maybe sometimes the risk factors for feeling lonely might be somewhat different. And here I'm really just also talking based on the like interviews that I've conducted and what I've seen. I think it really something that I can just think of, and it's not really backed up by clear quantitative data, but something that I've seen is that for especially men in cultures where traditionally it's the men who are responsible for finances, for instance, that here I could see that men often reported feeling lonely for having financial issues and not getting out of them. So I would say that very often loneliness results from certain norms that can also be gender norms. And I think that that this can be one thing that can increase the risk for loneliness among men. But I think another one that is probably much more relevant is that there is very often the gender norm that men should not show too much emotions, should not talk about their emotions and how they feel. And we see that in many cultures, suicide rates are usually much higher among men than among women.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons is that people don't talk. Men are expected not to talk about their emotions so much.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to loneliness, we see, as I said, that in cultures where that are more family oriented, usually loneliness is a little bit higher, or at least in some studies, it's a little bit higher. And our explanation is that here also social norms are often very strict. So that's is of course something different than having like communal bonds, but it correlates with each other. So often in these very family-oriented communal societies, norms are also a bit stricter and narrower, which also often implies that norms for men can be narrower and stricter in terms of you have to be heterosexual, you should get married, you should have children, you should provide for your family, and also often you have to be strong and you shouldn't show all too many emotions. And if that happens, then of course you will at some point feel lonely with your emotions because you can't really share them with others. And that is something that certainly creates loneliness.
It sounds like people that are in cultures that are more enmeshed are actually lonelier than culture, like enmeshed in terms of like family and socially, and like it's more, I don't know, it's probably more compressed in terms of you know, living like larger cities maybe or whatever, where it's just, it sounds like those people are more lonely than people that are maybe sort of isolated. That's what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
I would say it's not as clear cut. And also, I have to say that there are very different types of collectivism. So, we often traditionally in the literature think of, for instance, Japan. But Japan, I would say, is a bit of a special case because many people in Japan are very isolated. So, if we rather think of, let's say, really more, let's say, really family-oriented cultures, then we would often think, for instance, of Northern African families or also South Asian or Southeast Asian families. And I would also not like we have little data generally from these areas of the world. Um, but there are quite some studies that do find slightly higher loneliness in such cultures. I would say that the data, we just don't have sufficient data to say they feel lonelier. But I think what we can definitely conclude from the data is that we just don't have evidence that they feel less lonely, because they do not really seem to feel clearly less lonely, and that's in itself is already quite surprising to many people because they are way less socially isolated. And it is just a bit complex because there are so many different risk factors. There are so many different reasons for feeling lonely. And being alone is only one out of these many different reasons. And although, let's say, the risk of social isolation is higher in certain societies, you have other risks that are higher in other societies. So, in societies also where you cannot choose your relationships so much or can also not leave unfulfilling relationships that easily, let's say you're born into very unfulfilling family relationships, so also you can actually not separate from a partner that you have a terrible relationship with, that perpetuates loneliness. So that is one thing that can increase the risk for loneliness in such cultures. And I've also talked about social norms. So whenever we deviate from what is socially normative, so let's say if we are a man with strong emotions, that's often socially sanctioned somehow. So that will usually separate us a little bit from the rest. Or also, let's say, if we are divorced in a context where divorce is very uncommon, then the stigma will be so high that will make very lonely. So whenever we deviate from social norms, it will increase the risk for loneliness. And in these more family-oriented cultures, often the social norms are just stricter, and social sanctions can sometimes be also stronger. And this is a different type of risk that is increased. And one more thing is also that people just get used to being by themselves or being with others. So what I've often seen in my interviews is something that people, when they have been together with other people or also with someone else, and then after the separation, right after, it's the loneliest time because one has become very used to being with others, and then being alone is it's a very different state. You need to get used to it again, and then there will often be a lot of loneliness at that state or stage, and then it will get a bit better once you get used to being by yourself again.
Wow,
Um,
that's
yeah.
fascinating. So I mean, one of the things that I was going to ask was, do you need to surround yourself with people to not feel lonely? But it doesn't seem like that's as much of a factor. Like that can even maybe exacerbate in some kind of weird way. So if you're already feeling sort of lonely and you put yourself out there and get out there with and surround yourself with people, it might even backfire in some ways because you might not connect with those people, et cetera, et cetera. And it would then, so the answer, and we're going to get to some of that stuff, but the answer clearly isn't just surround yourself with more people.
No, definitely not. Usually, what I say is that it's very important to first understand where does the loneliness come from? And also, what kind of person are you and what do you need? Because some people are quite extroverted people and they need others around a lot. So then, if they feel lonely, it can often be a sign that they need more social contact. But for many people, this is not the solution because, just as you say, it can even trigger more loneliness. If you are, let's say, part of a marginalized group and you just go have dinner with random others, the chances are quite high that you will again experience rejection, which will actually often make you feel lonelier than if you just spent the evening by yourself. And this is quite ironic because most interventions against loneliness now, in my view, really stereotype lonely people,
Yeah,
because they're usually just about we need more social contact, we need more social connection. But this is very often, in my experience, not what the problem of people who feel lonely is. And don't get me wrong, it can be the problem of people who feel lonely,
sure.
but very often it's not the case. And I've very often also seen people say, yeah, I don't understand. I feel lonely even though I have people around me, and that comes from these stereotypes.
Interesting. So then, I mean, that leads to the question, like, what do you do then? And one of the things I thought of since we were talking is and if there's any data on this, is there anything that says that online connection, online interaction can combat loneliness? So let's start there, and then maybe roll into what is the ultimate, what do you do? But let's start with, does that help with loneliness? These types of interactions.
Yeah. So as far as I know, the evidence there is a bit mixed and it depends on how online interaction is used. So from what I know, if we use social interaction to replace offline interaction, then it will often or can exacerbate loneliness because it's in a way not the same as really meeting up with someone. But if it's a way of staying in touch with people who are far away, for instance, it can reduce loneliness. So if these are real relationships. And I also think that especially for groups that have that are a bit marginalized in society, or for people who have characteristics that you just don't find in anyone around you, this can be a very useful way of connecting to people who have gone through similar experiences, because I think that sharing experiences, and even if it's basically just sharing, I feel lonely right now. Oh, yeah, me too. I feel so lonely. That's already eases loneliness a little. So I think in that sense, it can be very useful. But of course, yeah, as I said, if it really replaces all offline contacts, then it can also increase loneliness.
Oh man, so it's not an easy answer, is it? There's no like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. So let's get to some of what besides that portion. What is the answer, or answers apparently, that to if someone is listening to this and they're like, man, I'm just so lonely. What do they do? How do they best try and tackle the issue?
Yeah, this is also, I'm sorry, like
Yeah,
everything, loneliness is just extremely complex. Why?
yeah,
Because loneliness, I often compare loneliness to sadness. We think loneliness is a very specific, homogeneous phenomenon, but loneliness is like sadness. It's one symptom that can have many different causes and underlying reasons. And I think one of the most important things is just first to figure out how long have I been lonely for, or feeling lonely for, and what is the cause for my loneliness. Some people that I talk to who feel what we call chronically lonely, so people who really feel lonely for a big share of their lives or all of their lives, they're often the onset is in childhood. And we also see from studies that there is quite a genetic component in whether or not people feel lonely. So almost half of the variation in loneliness seems to be explainable by genetic disposition. So some people are just more vulnerable to feeling lonely than others.
huh.
And a different person would not react with loneliness to a situation. They might, I don't know, get angry or sad, but they might not feel so lonely. So first, you maybe need to figure out, do I have a certain disposition to feel lonely? And if it's rooted, which is very often the case, it's rooted actually in your early childhood experiences, in your interactions also with your parents, in early experiences of rejection at school, for instance. All these things, they can trigger certain patterns of thought or also behavior and perceptions of our relationships, where we really focus also on rejection and therefore don't feel so connected very often. So then sometimes actually, if you feel very lonely, then going to psychotherapy is a good idea.
Mm.
So that's one way if you have been feeling lonely for a very long time. If you belong to a marginalized group or a group where you feel like it's important for you to share experiences with others who have gone through something similar, then it can be good to form support groups or join support groups of people with similar experiences, I think. Often we also feel lonely for specific situations, so for certain life events. And that's also important. Loneliness is a part of life. We now pathologize it a lot, but loneliness itself, if it's not very long lasting, is something that most people encounter at some point. Why? Because we all lose people, we all separate from other people, we all face problems in our lives. And these can all make us feel lonely. And what I've learned from my participants is that one of the most important things in the first place is to accept that also to some extent, to really see, okay, I'm in this position right now. I don't know, I'm just saying I've just gone through a divorce. It's very
Right.
normal now to feel lonely. And it's not that I have failed, that I've done anything wrong. And even just acknowledging that can often be a first relief to just understand, okay, I'm fine. It's not that I have done anything wrong for feeling lonely. What helps a lot of people then is like if it's a manageable level of loneliness, you don't need to go and see a psychologist or therapist. Can be on the one hand also if you don't have people around who have gone through similar experiences. It can even be reading books, watching series, movies with people who have made similar experiences. That can also like this representation can be very soothing, and often also focusing on things that one enjoys doing is something that people told me a lot of times. Going out, moving, going into nature, making music if you enjoy it. I see the guitar in the background.
Yeah.
Reading, focusing on all kinds of hobbies that they like to do, getting busy. So some people like to distract themselves from the feeling.
Mm.
Other people like to really go into the feeling and journal about it, write about it if it gets very strong, sing about it if that helps, meditate. Religion or spirituality are important. That can also be a very great source of support. And yeah, I think now I've said most of the things that I learned from my participants. As you see, there are very many different approaches. Oh yeah, one more thing, very important. Sometimes if there is a close other person in your life, reaching out and having contact with someone that you feel connected to or close to, that for many people is something that they do.
Let me ask you, if you don't mind, why did you dive into this? Is this something that has always interested you, or something that happened in your life? I mean, you don't you can you don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about, obviously, but why did you dive into this? I'm just curious.
Mm. Yeah, originally theoretical interest because I wrote a paper still during my master's where I was just curious because uh, coming from a culture where it's very common for young people to move away from their families, I experienced a lot of loneliness when I lived by myself and I had individual contacts. And I've also figured that I'm a person, I really need community.
Mm.
I am very bad at, even though I'm very much of an introvert also, but I have a very extroverted side too, and I need people around. And I was just curious if people in cultures where people stay with their families experience such loneliness less. So that was the
Huh.
starting point. And I think generally being a person who is also susceptible to feeling lonely, I think this has allowed me to actually focus on aspects of loneliness that I often don't see very reflected in the loneliness literature or in how people talk about it. Because
Mm.
very often they don't look at their own experiences, but they talk about other people as if it was this group of lonely people, which is curious because most people do feel lonely sometimes.
Yeah.
But I think it actually makes the research better to have some experiences of loneliness oneself.
Did you find the process of, first of all, how long did it take you? Like all the research, I mean, it sounds like you said 9 years. So is that how long? Is it still ongoing? And did that process make you feel less lonely?
So it's just that I focus on different aspects of loneliness over time, and like you focus on different topics. So I used to focus much more on culture and loneliness. Now focus more on not fitting in with others,
Mm.
feeling different from others, and the loneliness that results from that. Or also now I focus on this more chronic type of loneliness that requires support and intervention versus the situational loneliness and how they develop differently. So it's just that the focus of my research is different. But yeah, I still do research about that. And what was the other question?
Did
Oh,
did
if
it
it made
make you
me
feel less lonely? Yeah.
if it made me feel less lonely. Sometimes yes. Sometimes, yes. What was quite interesting for me is on the one hand, yeah, definitely through reading about other people's experiences, I just understood that, like, I understood many of my own experiences better as well. And people often ask me, so don't you get very lonely through your research? And I think these are usually people who don't know much about how loneliness works, because I think in general, just connecting to
Yeah.
other people's experiences at so much depth, for me, the way I function, it, if anything, made me feel more connected than anything else.
I would imagine it would because you're interacting with people. I'm assuming you're interviewing people. You're probably staying in touch somewhat. You probably get to know these people a little bit, and so that must make you feel connected because, and especially because it's kind of like me. And not that I'm not a doctor or anything. I'm just a dude in the basement in Pennsylvania. But like these moments, the internet issues that we've had aside, which make me want to break things, um that aside, like it's these conversations are so awesome. And yeah, you're across the world, right? You're in the Netherlands, nowhere near me, but I feel like these conversations making me feel connected and less alone for sure.
Yeah.
So I got to imagine it would be a very sort of fulfilling, and you're also sort of looking for some answers, and you're probably helping people. That's a question. Are you helping people in terms of the people that you're dealing with? Do you also, besides ask questions, do you say, "Hey, have you tried this? Have you tried that?" Do you sort of I don't know if it's de facto or if it's just straight up help people through the research?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So I have to say, not actively, but I do see, and this has for me always been very important also in the way I do my research. So we have in psychology quantitative research, which is giving questionnaires that are usually filled in on the computer, or doing qualitative research, which I've come to work much more with, where you do interviews and you talk to people. And even though I don't actively suggest things, because I'm not a psychotherapist or a trained psychologist or counselor. So I also think it would be a bit beyond my capacities. But what I do see, and this is so, it's beautiful, you usually see when participants come that they are tense. And then we talk about loneliness and we talk about their experiences for an hour, which are really only focused on their experience, and also just really understanding what they have experienced in depth. And just giving this attention, you can really see in most people how that changes how they feel. And usually I could see that people felt very happy and positive after the interviews. And for me, this is just my personal observation as a human being. I just find it very beautiful to see how the mere act of paying attention to what someone else has experienced can make another person feel seen and feel better. So I think in that sense, that's also why I do still do qualitative research, because I do see this benefit on the other end as well.
I mean, that's the message then, right? I mean, in terms of like feeling, maybe it's not, well, it's clearly not like being about around people, but it's connecting with people. It's feeling, maybe feeling seen, feeling heard. Is that
Yeah.
is that the ultimate antidote to loneliness then?
I could imagine. I mean, there is, of course, you can have your filters where you just will not feel heard or seen by other people because of what you've experienced yourself. Pretty much whatever they do, because you will always expect that they have negative intention with what they do. It's fascinating. The research really shows how we can start to interpret the world differently based on what we've experienced earlier, and how we then start acting in a way that pushes other people away. Um,
That
but in
makes
the end,
sense.
I would also say that making people feel understood and heard is very important. And I was just thinking of something, because you also asked me if I actively do something. Actually, I said no, and that's now I remember it's not entirely true, because the project that I talked about the meanings of loneliness. So there, I also did make a film project out of it. So there is a website connected to it, where the idea was to share these people's wisdom, knowledge, experiences, and also make people just see that their experiences are normal, that there are other people who make these experiences too around the world. Yeah, so that is all on a website. It's more than 40 videos with causes for loneliness, definitions of loneliness, but also remedies for loneliness by people from these 5 different countries. And surprisingly, also most of the participants were willing to participate in the film project with their video, with their faces taken, talking about their loneliness experiences, which is quite brave, I think, in the first place.
Yeah, I think anytime anyone is vulnerable, it's a very brave thing to do, and
Yeah,
especially if it's going to be seen by the entire world. So,
yeah,
I think you sent me the link to that. I did check it out last night, and I will make sure to put it in the show notes, and
wonderful.
encourage people to go there. I want to touch on just the sort of before we get to the last question. And that is just how do people find you? Is the website the best way? Is there any other way that if anyone's interested in your research, your work, or wants to participate in projects or whatever, how can they best reach you?
Yeah, I think via email is great, and that's just on the university website. There's my email address, my current email address. Yeah.
Okay, I can if it's all right.
Otherwise, I'm also on,
I can
yeah,
put
I'm
that
also on
in the.
LinkedIn.
You're on LinkedIn. Okay, I can put. Okay, all
Yeah,
right.
so if anyone would like to reach out there, that's also a possibility.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the last question that I asked everybody is, what words of wisdom would you impart to a man who is just beginning his divorce journey?
Okay. Um, so given that we have talked about loneliness, and I think I've also said, I think that especially after an experience like this, it's very normal to feel lonely, and it's very important to just accept that for a while and just see that this is a very normal process, that there is no failure involved, and that it's also fine to feel it for a while, but also that there are ways of distracting oneself and easing this loneliness, because most of the time it will just pass. It will just require some time.
Oh, excellent words of wisdom. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I very much
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching and or listening. If you are feeling alone on this journey, please join our Discord server. Becoming a phoenix is not a solitary act. It is one achieved through community. Our Discord server is just that, a community of men fighting to survive, thrive, and rise from their divorce. Go to risingphoenixpodcast.com/Discord for information on how to join and what is contained in our Discord server. Please join us.